Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we are looking at Dr. Chad McIntosh's recent response to my 12-hour-long video. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm going to be putting this video right here on 1.25 times speed, and I'm going to do the same with my video here, as I play it. Now, just a few preliminary remarks. All three of the people featured here in this video, I consider myself very lucky to call my friends. We got Tyler McNabb here, we've got Mike DeVito here, and we've got Chad McIntosh here. This recording, this video right here, is posted on the channel Furthering Christendom. I've linked both the channel and the video that I'm responding to in the description. I actually highly recommend checking out Furthering Christendom's channel. But without further ado, let's get into Chad's response to my 12-hour video.
Joe Schmidt responded on his channel to your 100 theistic arguments. And so I'm just wondering, did you get a chance to look at that, and do you have any sort of comments in response to Joe's stuff?
Yeah, well, I think it was something like 10 or 12 hours long, so I didn't watch the whole thing, right? I don't think anyone watched the whole thing, but...
Well, actually, just a quick pause there. Lots of people have emailed me, PM'd me, and so on, saying that they watched the whole thing and were tremendously grateful for how much it served them. And I have to say, it always puts a smile on my face when my content and work can serve people in their pursuit of truth. That's really the goal of all of this. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, so let's continue.
Honestly, I thought it was a bit... I thought it was poor form, by academic standards, especially what I've come to expect from Joe. You know, it's one thing to do all the work of reading an author and presenting their argument as charitably as possible and combing through the literature as I did. And of course, even doing that, just presenting an author, the bare bones of an author's argument without defense as I did, is risky because you risk not giving the author their due, right? But my purpose in the original Capturing Christianity video was just to expose people to these arguments, not to defend them. So to then criticize an author without doing the work of reading them in detail, going through the literature like I did, and relying instead on my own bare bones outlines, I think, that's a little unfair and academically lazy. It was beaten into me in undergrad that you have to earn the right to criticize. And I don't think Joe really earned the right to criticize a lot of those arguments because evidently he didn't read a lot of those papers. He was just coming up with criticisms on the cuff. And I think that's academically lazy.
I honestly find this quite bizarre. First, for the vast majority of the arguments, and I say the vast majority of the arguments, I have read the authors in detail. I have read the papers criticizing the arguments in detail. I have combed through the relevant literature, and so on. In fact, for many of these arguments, I've actually published on them. Right? Aquinas' First Way and Aquinas' Second Way and per se chains. I published on the Kalam and causal finitism, as well as I have 2 papers under review on them. I've got 2 papers under review on almost all modal cosmological arguments, and I've got 2 papers under review on modal ontological arguments. I've also got a forthcoming book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs, wherein I assess in depth many of the non-traditional arguments in Chad's list, like the arguments from sustaining causation, arguments from composition, theistic conceptualist arguments from Proust and Rasmussen and Anderson and Welty, Greg Menzel's argument from sets, Goldschmidt's argument from numbers, and so on ad nauseum. In fact, this is only the work I've explicitly published on. I've also researched the other arguments in tremendous depth. For many of the moral arguments I've read and or drew on in the video, papers and books from Wielenberg, Craig, Baggett, Flanagan, Morriston and company. For the teleological arguments, Hud Hudson, Luke Barnes, Robin Collins, Neil Sinababu, Neil Manson. For experiential arguments, the SEP entry thereon, Rudolph Otto, Paul Draper, Caroline Franks Davis, Bill Alston and company, and so on ad nauseum. In fact, let's just get a glimpse of the scholarly literature I explicitly drew on in the video to respond to the arguments, or at least many of the arguments. Actually, we don't have to go through all of this, but in some of these where they're videos, right? They're based on videos, which in turn I'm drawing on the literature. So in this one, I mentioned the work of Mike DeVito and Tyler McNabb themselves. I mentioned and draw on the work of Oppie, Oderberg, Gavin Kerr, etc. Existence and Ontological Pluralism. This is drawing from a paper published in News by Dr. Trenton Merricks. Scott McDonald, his Aquinas' Parasitic Cosmological Arguments, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, you go through here, Galen Proust, Oppie, Galen Proust, Tomaszewski, his paper. I mean, Felipe Leon, one of his book chapters. Graham Oppie, Draper's SEP article. I mean, you can go through this list, this resources that I put together, and you can see boatloads of scholarly resources that I drew on in the video, as anyone would be able to see if they watched the whole thing. It's more, nothing in this document. This doesn't even touch the scholarly content that I actually drew on without explicitly mentioning in the video. So these resources here, right, this 11-page document, this doesn't actually contain all of the scholarly content that I drew on, because lots of content that I drew on weren't actually explicitly mentioned in the video. So for instance, in the argument from desire portion of the video, I drew heavily on Slater Semek, I think that's how you might pronounce that, but I drew heavily on this article. And, you know, I can go on and on and on about all the different papers and so on that I drew from. But my point is just that even when I didn't explicitly mention and go through sources in my video, a lot of the criticisms that I was making was actually informed by relevant literature. So I would say that the one being unfair here isn't me. It seems to be Chad for completely neglecting the fact that for the vast majority of the arguments in the list, I have looked extensively into the literature pertaining to them. And the one being academically lazy most certainly isn't me. If anything, it's academically lazy to criticize another academic without properly appreciating the depth and extent into which they've examined the literature on these arguments. This brings me to my second point in response to Chad here. For it is true that for at least some of the arguments, I didn't look into the literature on them. Again, they're in the small minority, but they're still there. But there's absolutely nothing wrong or unfair or quote-unquote academically lazy about offering tentative criticisms of arguments in a popular YouTube video format without reading the source material, so long as it's done with proper epistemic humility and with explicit recognition that one hasn't yet read the source material. And lo and behold, this is precisely what I did. I repeatedly emphasized that I hadn't read the primary literature when I was examining arguments for which I hadn't read the primary literature. And I explicitly said that we, both me and the audience listening, should therefore have the proper epistemic humility when considering my criticisms thereof. And I also repeatedly emphasized throughout the video, again when engaging arguments for which I haven't read the primary literature, that the author of the argument may very well have thought of and responded to my criticisms. I don't know how I could have been clearer about all of this. Once all of this is made explicit, there's absolutely nothing wrong with proceeding to give criticisms of such arguments. Again, the criticisms are explicitly situated within a context wherein it is recognized and affirmed that I haven't read the primary literature, and wherein it is recognized and affirmed that the author of the argument may very well have adequately responded to my criticisms, and wherein it is recognized and affirmed that we should therefore have the requisite epistemic humility with respect to my criticisms. As I explicitly said, time and again, I'm responding to the arguments from my current epistemic vantage point, with full recognition that this vantage point doesn't encompass having read the literature on absolutely every single argument being criticized. It's simply self-evident that there's nothing wrong with offering tentative criticisms of arguments when all of the preceding is made thoroughly explicit. And again, all the preceding was made thoroughly explicit in my video. To say otherwise is to adopt an absurd form of gatekeeping, wherein one can only offer criticisms of an argument if one has combed through the relevant literature. Another thing to keep in mind here is the forum. If I were writing an academic article on some of these arguments, of course it would be unacceptable not to comb through the literature on them. If I were writing articles on every single one of these arguments, then I would and should be deeply familiar with the literature surrounding each of the arguments. But, if some of you haven't noticed already, YouTube isn't a forum wherein academic articles are published. It's a forum wherein people can discuss, wherein tentative suggestions and criticisms and arguments can be offered without having to first comb the depths of the philosophical literature. Thus, once we take into account the further fact that my video was precisely that, a video, it becomes even more evident that the charge of being unfair or academically lazy is simply wrong-headed. Now, to bolster my second point, I actually collected together a series of 10 short clips from my video that show my repeated and explicit recognitions of where, let's say, I hadn't researched an argument or read the source material, or where I called for epistemic humility because of this, and so on. These most certainly aren't the only examples from my video. I more or less just went through here and just clicked on certain arbitrary points because I knew that I did it so much that I'd be able to find them pretty easily. But I wanted to give at least some concrete examples to support my claims in this second point of mine in response to Chad. So let's get into those 10 clips.
And nor am I claiming that the criticisms that I'm going to be leveling in this video are knocked down, right? These are just reflections that I hope will serve you guys, that'll allow you guys to think critically and probe these arguments with the lights of reason and experience. A sixth note is that we all have to take some humble pie here. We all have to try to cultivate intellectual humility in these sorts of domains. What's the point of this video? Well, it's a semi-comprehensive survey of theistic arguments outlined as teasers, pointing to resources for you to go deeper on the arguments that pique your interest.
I also want to echo that in large part the purpose of my video here that you're listening to is to give a quasi-comprehensive list of responses that I myself find reasonably plausible to these sorts of arguments, so that it'll pique your interest, so that the criticisms will pique your interest, and will not only allow you to pursue the specific arguments in depth further, but also specific criticisms of the arguments further. And I'm going to be pointing to you guys to various resources along the way, both resources that I've created in terms of my playlists or my YouTube videos, but also resources in terms of other people's videos and professional scholarly books and articles and so on published in response to and in criticism of the arguments that we're going to be considering. Of course, we can look at the sources, but again, I'm not doing much additional research in addition to what I've already done over the many years that I've been studying this sort of thing. I'm not particularly familiar with this argument in particular, so I'm not going to do the additional research that would be required for me to go to the chapter or paper and read what the PPE is and read the various motivations. But again, I could be missing something, right? We have to have the requisite epistemic humility when we are evaluating these sorts of arguments, especially when we haven't done extreme amounts of research into each and every single one of them. Anyway, I recognize that I am not a Descartes scholar, so there may very well be things that I am eliding here, that I am overlooking. So yeah, let's just move on. Yeah, so I haven't researched this particular argument in significant detail. So I'm actually inclined to think that discoverability is evidence for theism, because NDEs is not really my area of either interest or expertise, right? So I perfectly well recognize that if there were some NDE expert, they could probably wipe the floor with me if I were trying to debate with them. Yeah, I think premise 2 is implausible. At least right now I don't see sufficient reason to think that it's true, but of course I'd probably have to look into the resources. Just from my epistemic vantage point, I'm just going to reject premise 2. Lots more can be said, and I probably need to research this further to have developed thoughts. I'm sure the author is well aware of the criticisms that I have just made, so I'd have to research this further to have an opinion on it. At face value, I'd find 3 to be implausible, but I just have to look at the justification offered for premise 3 in order to make a fully reasoned assessment about this argument. So let's just continue. So again, I just wanted to play that series of clips to give kind of empirical evidence for the various claims that I made in my second response to Chad. So let's continue with Chad.
Let me say one more thing about that, is that he also said a lot of the arguments were just invalid. And what he meant by that, I think, is that he thinks a lot of them commit the informal fallacy of begging the question. But I think that's misleading. Joe knows that it's often extremely difficult to determine when an argument begs the question, and it's almost always debatable whether or not an argument begs the question, because informal fallacies are just so context sensitive. So to blast a bunch of the arguments as invalid as he did, I think, is actually a little silly.
So there's a lot of irony here. What's ironic is that, at least by my lights, one wouldn't be unwarranted in saying that Chad is being academically lazy here. And, to quote a special phrase from earlier, he hasn't even earned the right to criticize my video, since evidently he didn't give it proper consideration. First, all I said in the video was that some of the arguments were invalid. I didn't, quote-unquote, blast a bunch of the arguments as invalid, as Chad describes. What I want to say here is that many of the arguments that we've considered here are staggeringly weak. Some of them are demonstrably invalid. Yes, you heard that right, straight up invalid. Many had premises that are clearly and obviously false, and still others were blatantly dialectically toothless. So my actual claim was that some of the arguments were invalid. And I'm provably right here. I'll just take 2 that are salient in my memory right now, but there were, of course, more. So let's get on to those 2.
Lowe's arguments on abstract objects exist necessarily, but all abstract objects depend on concrete objects, so there must be a necessarily existent concrete object. We have phasers, objects.
Yeah, so firstly, definitely see my God and Abstract Objects playlist, because I go over these sorts of arguments in tremendous depth therein. Now, what's actually kind of interesting is that this argument here is just quite obviously invalid. First, if some abstract objects exist necessarily and abstract objects depend for their existence on concrete objects, it doesn't follow that at least one concrete object exists necessarily. It could be the case that necessarily there are some concrete objects or other. And in that case, abstract objects could depend for their existence on concrete objects while they're necessarily existent, because there are some concrete objects or other in every single possible world, right? So there's no empty world which is devoid of concrete objects. And so you could have necessarily existent abstract objects depend for their existence on concrete objects, even if absolutely every single concrete object is such that it contingently exists. Again, all you need is that necessarily there is some concrete object or other. So this conclusion here doesn't follow. Perfectly compatible with premises 1 and 2 is the claim that every single concrete object exists contingently. So this argument is just facially invalid. Of course, you can always add a premise to the effect of, oh, well, if some abstract objects exist necessarily, and if abstract objects depend for their existence on concrete objects, then there's at least one concrete object that exists necessarily. But then, of course, you're just relocating the problem. Then we're asking, why should we accept that premise? Why shouldn't we think that that premise is just a non sequitur? After all, I've just given a situation wherein, at least in principle, the antecedent of that conditional could be true while the consequent is false. So we would need some reason to think that that conditional, even if you add it to this to make it valid, we would need some reason to think that that conditional is true. Yeah, and I mean, you could just show this. I mean, if you want me to whip out the first order propositional calculus, can if you want, but this is a point that's recognized in literature. Pearson Rasmussen, for instance, recognize it, but just the conclusion here doesn't follow from 1 and 2. Perfectly compatible, perfectly consistent with 1 and 2 is that every concrete object exists contingently. in which case it would be false that at least one concrete object exists necessarily, and yet both of these premises could be true in such a situation. And what that shows is that this argument is straight up invalid. And you can demonstrably prove this. I can get out the first order propositional calculus if you want me to. I don't want to bore you with that. So that's just the first one that came to mind, my memory. Now let's go on to the second one that came to my mind.
The argument is invalid. Look at this. 1 through 3 don't entail 4. 4 says, so that which explains what holds contingent beings together through time must be a necessary, incomposite, atemporal, sustaining case. Now, of course, they mean cause. But this is obviously invalid. All you're able to conclude is that what explains why things persist through time is a necessary thing, because it says, well, it can't be, again, we're assuming the truth of all the premises, 1, 2, and 3. Given that, all you're able to conclude is that the thing is necessary. You can't conclude that it's incomposite. From the fact that all contingent beings are composite and temporal, it doesn't follow that all necessary beings are non-composite and non-temporal. It could be the case that all contingent beings are composite and temporal, and all necessary beings are composite and temporal. Or maybe all necessary beings are simple, but yet temporal. Or maybe all necessary beings are timeless, but yet composite. That's perfectly compatible with 1. So literally, this is an invalid argument. The conclusion doesn't even follow from the premises. All you're able to get from the premises is that this thing is necessary. You can't conclude that it's incomposite. Nothing in the premises justifies that. You can't conclude that it's atemporal. Nothing in the premises justifies that.
What I want to point out here is that, ironically, Chad was earlier castigating me for the very thing he's exhibiting to the highest extent here. Chad clearly didn't do his homework. If he had actually done his due diligence, he wouldn't be throwing around baseless and clearly false accusations. He would have seen that I'm actually provably correct, that some of the arguments are invalid, in the strict sense of the conclusions not following logically from the premises. Something else that's academically lazy, or perhaps bordering on the academically slanderous, is suggesting that I either don't know or mistakenly overlooked the elementary distinction between formal and informal fallacies, between invalid reasoning on the one hand and question-begging on the other. Of course I know this distinction, and of course I didn't mistakenly overlook such a simple Philosophy 101 distinction. I meant to say what I said when I said that some of the arguments were invalid, and what I said was provably correct. So, if anything is quote-unquote a little silly, to use Chad's phrase, it's Chad's criticism of my video. But let's hear the end of Chad's response to my video.
I love Joe. God bless him. I don't want to sound too harsh because I love his work, but that's why I'm judging him to maybe a higher standard than I would some of the other responses that I've seen.
Right, so I do deeply appreciate this, and the same is said in return to Chad, right? I love Chad, I'm friends with Chad, and so I deeply appreciate his engaging with the video and his watching at least portions of it. I really do truly appreciate that, and I deeply appreciate both Chad and my friendship with Chad, as well as my friendship with Mike DeVito and Tyler McNabb. All 3 of these guys are really great guys with integrity. My responses to Chad might have sounded harsh, but that's also because I hold Chad to a high standard. Just as he holds me to a high standard, I hold him to a high standard, right? That's what friends do. I know Chad, and he's a man of integrity. I just think he was a little bit too quick in his criticisms of my video, resulting in some mistaken criticisms. Now, just some meta points here. I did think it was a little bit, I don't know what's the correct word, just a little bit frustrating that he didn't say anything positive about my video. Now, in my video, I try to make conscious efforts to say positive things about videos that I'm criticizing, because I don't know, it lowers our kind of tribalistic instincts. It shows that we appreciate and value the things that the other people are doing. So I said lots of positive things about Chad's video, their video, when I was making mine. And Chad could have said things like, well, my video did a really nice job serving thousands of people interested in God's existence by putting serious, scholarly criticisms of the arguments on their radars and explaining them to a popular audience. It thereby helps sharpen people's tools for critical, reflective, and love-oriented thinking surrounding arguments for God's existence. I mean, he could have said anything to that effect, but he didn't. Now, of course, he's not required to do that, right? But it would at least have been nice if, when asked about your thoughts about the video, you have both positive and negative thoughts to share. That's just one thing that I wanted to say. Let me end then by offering a series of positive comments about Chad's video, many of which I've said in the 12-hour-long video. First, I really enjoyed the accessibility of their video, right? They're taking Chad specifically, right? Chad is taking these ivory tower arguments published in journals and papers and books and so on. He's taking these from the ivory tower and he's bringing them down to the everyday person, right? To someone who's interested in apologetics and philosophy and these sorts of things. That's profoundly valuable. He's making these sorts of things accessible. That's part of my passion. And so I just really want to congratulate Chad on that and the hours upon hours, even dozens of hours of work that Chad has put into that. That's beautiful. It's wonderful. And we are all indebted. Everyone in the philosophy of religion community is indebted to Chad for this. Second, the breadth and depth of that video is astonishing. He has put together a really good collection and he's imposed really great order on it that can allow both researchers and lay people interested in the arguments to structure their approach to them. So I think that's also something that's wonderful, both the breadth and the depth of the work. Third, and I've sort of intimated at this, but we really should all appreciate Chad for the hours upon hours upon hours that he's put into his video here, right? We are all indebted to him in the philosophy of religion apologetics/counterapologetics community. Fourth, I think what he did really advances debates into new territory, right? He's putting new arguments on the map, he's encouraging exploration into them, and he's really just making people aware of things that they otherwise might not have been aware of. Fifth, and finally, Chad has served thousands upon thousands by helping them think with care, caution, and rigor about one of the most important questions humans can ask. So anyway, that concludes this video. I want to say thanks to Chad for his critical engagement with my video. Again, while I was harsh on him at times, I do it in the spirit of collaborative inquiry, in the spirit of edification, and really in the spirit of service. And what better way to end is there than, I'm Joe Schmid, this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.